Saddam Hussein's last stand, the chilling truth behind his final words. As the first light of December 30th, 2006 touched the skyline of Baghdad, the world stood still. Behind concrete walls and guarded gates, a man who once ruled a nation through fear faced the moment he could no longer control. Saddam Hussein, the figure who had shaped Iraq's destiny for decades, was about to meet his own. Cameras rolled, guards whispered, and history watched as one of the most polarizing leaders of the modern age prepared to speak his final words. What he said and how he said it would echo far beyond the gallows, stirring debate, disbelief, and a haunting question about justice and humanity itself. Tonight, we look beyond the headlines to uncover the truth behind Saddam's final moments and the meaning behind his last words. If you haven't already, subscribe now for more deep, thought-provoking explorations of history's most defining moments. Just 3 years earlier, his world had come crashing down. The 2003 invasion of Iraq, led by the United States and its allies, shattered the foundations of his regime. What had once seemed unshakable collapsed in a matter of weeks. The Iraqi military, once a symbol of national pride, disintegrated under the weight of desertions. Commanders fled, soldiers abandoned their posts, and entire divisions vanished overnight. By April, Baghdad had fallen. The golden statues that once celebrated his glory were torn down, their faces dragged through the dust by the very people who had once feared to look at them. But Saddam did not surrender. He retreated into the shadows, disappearing into the network of villages and safe houses near his birthplace of Tikrit. There, among loyal tribes and remnants of his inner circle, he plotted survival. For months, he became a ghost, unseen, unheard, and yet never forgotten. His disappearance only deepened his myth. To his enemies, he was a fugitive. To his remaining followers, he was a symbol of endurance. The search for him became one of the most intense manhunts in modern history. American forces interrogated tribal elders, former officers, and family members, chasing rumors that led from one desolate farmhouse to another. Each tip brought them closer. Then, in December 2003, the chase ended. Acting on intelligence from those who had once served him, Task Force 121 raided a small farmhouse near Ad-Dar outside Tikrit. Under the floorboards, concealed by planks and earth, soldiers uncovered a narrow underground hideout barely large enough for a man to lie down. When the hatch was lifted, the light fell on a bearded face. There he was, unarmed, weary, and silent. The man who had once controlled millions now emerged from a hole in the ground, clutching a pistol, a rifle, and $750,000 in cash. The soldiers called it the spider hole. That image of Saddam Hussein blinking against the beam of a flashlight became the defining picture of his downfall. His capture marked not just the end of his rule, but the beginning of his reckoning. In 2004, Saddam was put on trial by the Iraqi Special Tribunal, charged with crimes against humanity for decades of brutal repression. Among the charges were the Dujail massacre, in which more than 140 men and boys were executed, and the atrocities of the Anfal campaign against the Kurds. The trial was meant to be a symbol of justice, Iraq confronting its own dark past, but it soon descended into chaos. Saddam refused to recognize the authority of the court. He interrupted the judges, argued with prosecutors, and declared himself still the legitimate president of Iraq. His lawyers were threatened, some even killed. Outside the courtroom, Iraq was unraveling. Bombings, sectarian violence, and political instability turned the trial into a mirror of the nation's turmoil. For every Iraqi who wanted vengeance, another questioned whether the proceedings were fair or simply another act of revenge dressed as justice. Despite the turmoil, the verdict came swiftly. On November 5th, 2006, Saddam Hussein was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. His appeal was rejected within weeks. The new Iraqi government, eager to close this chapter before the new year, ordered that the execution take place before January. And so, the dawn of December 30th was chosen. That morning, guards entered his cell at Camp Justice. Saddam had refused sedatives. He dressed neatly in a dark coat, held a Quran, and asked to keep it until the final moment. Witnesses later described his demeanor as calm, almost proud. He greeted his executioners without fear. As he was led into the chamber, chants erupted, some calling for his death, others shouting insults. The room was thick with tension and chaos. The official cameras captured the proceedings until the final moment, but an unauthorized cell phone video recorded what followed, a moment that would ignite debate across the world. When the noose was placed around his neck, Saddam looked at his guards and began to speak. His voice was steady. Allah is the greatest. The nation will be victorious. Palestine is Arab. These were not pleas for mercy. They were proclamations, the same words he had repeated throughout his rule. Even in death, he framed himself as the defender of his cause, the man who stood against the West, the embodiment of Arab nationalism. Then, in a softer tone, he recited the Shahada. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. These were his final words. Moments later, the trapdoor opened. The man who once inspired both loyalty and terror was gone. The room fell silent for only a moment before erupting again in shouts. The footage, leaked online within hours, spread around the world, raw, unfiltered, and deeply disturbing. The execution that was meant to symbolize justice instead exposed deep divisions within Iraq. In some Sunni neighborhoods, people mourned, calling him a martyr. In Shia areas, crowds celebrated, claiming that decades of oppression had finally been avenged. Internationally, leaders and human rights organizations condemned the spectacle, arguing that his death looked less like justice and more like vengeance. Even President George W. Bush later admitted that the execution had been mishandled, too chaotic, too emotional, too symbolic of the wounds still open in Iraq. Dear friends, as the dust settled, one truth remained. Saddam Hussein's end did not bring closure. The fear he had sown lingered in the silence that followed. Iraq, already fractured by war and occupation, slipped deeper into violence. The dictator was gone, but the ghosts of his rule still walked among the living. In the prisons, in the ruins, in the whispered memories of those who had survived his reign. In the years that followed, Iraq would struggle to rebuild itself, haunted by the legacy of a man who had ruled through terror, yet died with defiance. His last words, Allah is the greatest, the nation will be victorious, Palestine is Arab, were not just declarations of faith. They were a final attempt to define his own story. To his enemies, they were empty bravado. To his followers, they were a vow that his spirit would endure. History remembers Saddam Hussein as both villain and enigma, a man who rose from poverty to power, who built an empire of fear, and who faced death with the same unyielding arrogance that had sustained him in life. But beyond the politics, his story remains a chilling reminder of the nature of power itself, how it corrupts, isolates, and ultimately consumes those who wield it. So when we think of Saddam's final moments, the cold air of that dawn, the shouts in the execution chamber, the voice that refused to break, we are left with more than just a historical event. We are left with a haunting image of a man staring into eternity, unrepentant, defiant, and alone. His words still echo in the silence of Baghdad's mornings, a testament not to strength, but to the tragedy of a leader who mistook fear for loyalty and power for immortality.